righty. Should we go to our interview portion of the program at this point? We mentioned it, but we got nothing else to talk about except modern wrestling, so we should go to the interview portion of the program.
Okay, we can do that right now.
Okay, we can do that. All right. Well, then I will let the people know, Brian, that the new season 3 of Dark Side of the Ring, premieres on Vice TV on Thursday night, May the 6th at 9:00 Eastern. It's a 2-hour special on Brian Pillman. And Vice has a Dark Side of the Ring marathon all day. If you want to get caught up on last season, they've got the extended cuts. They're playing the thing 24 hours that day. And we have the creators, the director, producer. They do everything on this program. Evan Husney and Jason Eisner. We are going to go to that interview that has been recorded, and we will do that portion, and then we will come back with the rest of this fine program. Is that correct, Mr. Last?
I believe so, Mr. Cornette.
Well, let's do that now. All right, the long-awaited interview, and nobody has awaited this interview any longer than the people we're about to talk to, the creators of the Dark Side of the Ring, Evan Husney and Jason Eisner. Season 3 is about to debut, and you guys have done it again.
Hey, Jim, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, it was on the comment that I made was on one of the spots announcing season 3 when I said, can't y'all do the happy side of the ring once in a while?
Yeah.
But also, and I'm so upset because every time you come to the castle and shoot these things, it's always dreary winter weather, no leaves on the everything's barren and brown. For the last 6 weeks, I've had the dogwood is beautiful, pink blooms, everything's in green and looking lovely. And you guys never shoot down here this time of year. You always wait until it's all barren and cold and wintry. It fits the flavor of the show better. You don't want a lot of sunshine and lollipops.
I know.
You want it looking like the old Dark House, or something when we shoot it.
But you always mention to us that tree is blooming, and even the other day, like the thought came across my mind. I thought, like, I bet that tree is blooming right now. Because I think you mentioned to us like every time we come over, and it's like, man, I can't wait to see that because it just sounds so beautiful, and you are so like proud of it. So it's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, get your shooting schedules in order where you can come down here in good weather. You could be down here on Derby weekend and pay $400 for one night in a hotel room. But anyway, the Dark Side of the Ring is debuting this Thursday, May the 6th, 9 p.m. Eastern. The 2-hour Pillman show will be the debut episode. And, Brian and I have been talking about it on the show here the past few weeks. A lot of these not wrestling programs, but more behind the scenes programs about wrestling, about wrestlers are taking over a lot of the networks. The A&E Austin bio was the biography episode was the most watched biography episode on that network in 16 years.
Oh,
The Dark Side of the Ring, that just came out this past week. The Dark Side of the Ring, season 1 was the highest rated series in Vice TV history. Season 2 beat that. Season 3 will probably beat that. They've got some other reality shows about wrestling. These shows about either great wrestling stars or just the inner workings of the wrestling business are outdrawing the actual wrestling shows. And I mean, it's an indictment of my former business that's happening, but the difference in what you guys are doing and the biography series, obviously, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Randy Macho Man Savage, Roddy Piper, they're going for the names. They're going for the household names that people knew and watched, and they're going for it in that respect, and they're getting numbers. But you guys, even though you have done major personalities and major names, especially in season 1, when you had to kind of get people educated what the deal was, you guys are going for the stories. You're telling stories. How important a guy was in the wrestling business only figures in part of it. It's also, how can we tell this story, and is this a story that somebody needs to tell, even if it's not a major name? And I think that's the difference in the programs.
Yeah, I can't see Johnny Canine making A&E part of that season, but And that is the cool thing, with being able to, I mean, especially getting into a season 3, it's just really cool that, we're able to explore stories like that. I mean, this guy is probably virtually relatively unknown to most wrestling fans, like Johnny K9, Bruiser Bedlam, and so it's cool to be like, here in 2021, let's spend an hour with him on, cable television. I think that's awesome.
Well, I think it's great because we talked, you guys and I, when we shot stuff for the first season, and we were all being honest with each other. This is a new program. People, obviously, the wrestling fans are going to be interested in the premise, but you had to kind of balance things with, we can't go to a deep album cut first season. We can't go to somebody that nobody's ever heard of, even if it is a fantastic story or an engrossing story, but we have to strike a balance. And now that the people have seen the programs, and it kind of, the program more stands on its own now. Even if you are not necessarily familiar with who the subject is, it's going to be some kind of wild ass tale. And so, you have the names this season. We'll talk about a few of them, here in a few minutes, but you've got the Ultimate Warriors, and you've got the Brian Pillmans, but you've also got, as you said, Bruiser Bedlam, Johnny K9, Chris Kanyon, which I can't wait for, because what a great guy he was. I just heard about Luna Vachon, and you're going to be tackling that this year. And of course, we already knew about Grizzly Smith and the whole Smith family. So obviously, the star of that to the public is Jake Roberts. He's the member of the family that most people know. But you're going a little bit deeper into guys that were either names in the territories or guys that were never names, but they have these weird stories. And that's why I'd mentioned Bruce. I got my my request honored this season with Bruiser Bedlam, because I said, where else are you going to find a story like this? And this guy that was literally two people to, it depended on who you were as to which one you saw. But let's talk about Brian Pillman.
Sure.
Because also that's the debut, and that's the one that I've seen the screener of. And you assholes, every time you do one of these shows, I mean, I probably won't break down in tears over the plane ride from hell episode or, the steroid trial episode. But every time you do one of these shows about somebody that I've known personally, at one point I end up having to pause it and walk away. And this, in the Pillman episode, it's 2 hours. There was a couple of those spots, and most of them, all of them, really centered on the comments that Brian Jr. made. And I'm not going to spoil anything for anybody, or there's no way I could deliver it the way it was said. But it really got to me. Especially, Brian was younger than I was when my dad passed away, and that's hard anyway. But for him to be left in the situation that he was in after his dad passed away is probably the worst part about it. And hearing him describe some of those things, he's breaking down, and I had to break down. I mean, you can read about these stories all day, but when you actually hear the family members speak and see their emotions, I think that's what makes these programs different from just the standard wrestling documentary that, gets a few talking heads in the business.
Yeah, I think, especially with this story, it's like, we always had a huge interest in Brian Pillman for the show because, the main, I don't know, the things for us that we want to explore with this show is always kind of where the character stops and the real person takes over, or vice versa. Sort of that blurred lines aspect is kind of the most fascinating area to really dig into for us in this show. And I think that's what really makes it interesting to non-fans. And so when we were looking into this story, and I think it was around last season where I had got a copy of Crazy Like a Fox, the book by Liam O'Rourke, which is just amazing. Yeah. And that just really detailed a lot of what was happening, outside of the wrestling side of his story. And that really opened my eyes. And then when we started filming it, we didn't think it would be a 2-hour show, to be honest, which is crazy in hindsight, because as soon as we started putting it all together and we interviewed Brian Jr. especially, and the other family members, and started to realize the story doesn't end with Brian's passing. There's a whole other even more than an epilogue. There's a whole other couple of chapters there and of their whole story. And that to us really was like, wow, we need the full 2 hours to tell this story. And yeah, Brian Jr. is just so amazing in that episode, and just what that family's had to go through, and of course just the complexity of the relationships between everybody in that family. And I think that really comes through. And and kudos to Brian Jr. for, even though those relationships are very complicated to this day, he still, recognized and was advocating that all members of his family do have a voice in the show, because it is important, and I think that really kind of makes it something more than just kind of a wrestling story.
Well, Brittany, at one point, she makes the comment and it just hits you in the face that by the time she was 2 years old, neither one of her biological parents were still alive.
I think she was like 7.
Was she a 7? Whatever, but, young enough. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the point is, all of a sudden here she's by the changing relationships, and then the new boyfriend comes in. She's living with 2 completely different parents.
I know.
Than who she started out with, and Brian was so young and left without his dad there. And I'll tell you one thing. You guys, I don't know whether you showed restraint or it just didn't fit and you didn't have to do it anyway. Because I'm sure I know that there's probably some stories that some people told you during this taping about Melanie Pillman that with details that you could have just played 1 or 2 of them. Mm-hmm. And people would have been after her in the town square with pitchforks and trying to burn her at the stake.
Right.
And that is that's the impression you're going to get from the program anyway when you watch it. But you guys exercised restraint in letting the viewer have that reaction on their own instead of all the information that you could have given them that would reinforce that opinion. She is the heel of the piece, whether intentionally or not. And everybody that was around Brian, in his life at that time probably feels the same way. But I mean, kudos to her for at least, being there. I mean, the years have not been kind, and this is a case of going literally from penthouse to the outhouse. But she did it.
Yeah, I think I'm very happy that we were able to get her, for this, because I mean, a lot of it is, her story as well. And, it goes back to what Jason and I wanted to do with this show from the very beginning. Dark Side of the Ring is the name. That's the name of the show. But really, it is the human side of the ring, as we've talked about before. It's really showing the complexities of not just the wrestlers, but the family members around these subjects, and how complicated life is. It's not so simple or black and white. And I think with this season in particular, with this episode and with some of the other ones, the Nick Gage one comes to mind too, is it's like we're really kind of capturing a snapshot of a story in that present moment. That story might not be over. Like a Brian Jr. story isn't definitely over. Right. It's just starting. And same with Melanie and her journey to reconcile and to come together with her family, if that's possible, so that was something we really wanted to show. And there are some things where I feel like there are semi double standards in their story as well. I mean, Brian wasn't the most faithful, husband either, and so it's kind of like we wanted to just show all of that. We wanted to show that, this was a wild marriage, and, some, and we wanted just to show the real drama behind all that.
Yeah. And seeing the relationship between Brian Pillman Jr. and his mom today. Yeah. Like, I think that's something a lot of people could probably relate to that have like fractured relationships, like with their parents and loved ones. And so to kind of see that honesty, between the two and how they are, still currently working out their relationship today, I think is pretty powerful to see.
That was, and I will say that without trying to spoil anything, just when Brian says, well, what am I supposed to do? Hate my mother or, all my life or whatever. Right. That's heart wrenching in itself. But, and you mentioned the Gage thing, the the bank addicted drug robber. I love you guys, but I wish you wouldn't take forays outside professional wrestling and validate these garbage wrestling goofs by calling them professional wrestlers. But I'm sure it'll be an interesting story. Who else is stupid enough to rob a bank with no mask on camera when you're a public figure and then go to the casino in Jersey with your winnings? But anyway,
did you see the episode somehow?
No, I had his number as soon as he walked through the door.
Okay.
We've heard all those stories, but anyway, you're also another one of the subjects coming up, and there's going to be 2 sets of season. This is public knowledge, right? That the season's going to be in 2 sets.
Yes,
that's right.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna have the first season for 6 weeks. With the 2-hour special, and then you're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back with the second half. And I'm not sure where this fits in. I believe it's the second half, but the steroid trials of the WWF in 92, 93 are going to get covered. And you guys actually got, and he will be appearing on camera, Jerry McDivitt to give their side of this story. How many souls did you have to sell to make this a reality?
Actually, it was quite easy. We've been, the steroid trials, one of the more significant moments in wrestling history outside the ring of the 90s for sure. Was just very, very, something always on our radar that we wanted to tell. But back in season 1, when we first considered it, we had just no street cred or, ways to get that level of access to tell that story properly. And it's just a really dense subject, like in order to find, like, how are you going to wrap your head around it? And I think after doing 2 seasons of the show, it's been easier for us to crack that. But we needed an anchor. We needed a big anchor to build the episode around. And then the idea was sort of pitched like, I think we were referencing like Fog of War, like let's do it kind of Fog of War style with Jerry McDivitt. And so I reached out to him and to his, I think his assistant, and left her a message, and then he called me back and we spoke, and he had some words for me on the Owen Hart episode, of course, but he he did for sure, which, okay, I understand. But we had talked those out, and then I pitched him the idea. I was like, I just want to tell this story. And, more or less the steroid trials is a masterclass of Jerry McDivitt's ability as an attorney. I mean, he's an incredible attorney. And so he thought about it. I'm sure he spoke to WWE about it, I would only assume, and then came back and said, let's go. And so we wound up doing 2 long form interviews with Jerry. We just finished the second one recently, and it's just fantastic, and it's really cool, I think, too, for us to be able to show that a company perspective in this series, and I'm really grateful for that, because this story, in a lot of ways, it's like, I don't know. I don't think Vince is necessarily the heel in this story, as he has been in some other stories of ours. But, this is kind of Vince looking at the kind of dark aspects of the story is kind of happening to Vince as he's looking for possible, jail time, in terms of for the charges that the government had against him. But it's also just a wild story of, wrestling playing out into the courtroom, the wrestling storyline coming out of the courtroom. And you look at the dramatic relationship between Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon. I mean, Hulk Hogan had to testify against Vince, and that was right at the time he had left to go to WCW. And like the drama behind that is better than any wrestling pay-per-view you could book, so all of that's just really fascinating. And Jerry was great. And I'm really looking forward to digging into that. We're still actively working on it. Because it's part of the back half, but did you guys actually find out whose post toasties did Vince piss in to really get that whole ball rolling? Because, and now some people are going, oh, now he's defending Vince after all these years. In the overall scheme of major drug transporters, steroid distributors, where would Vince McMahon have ranked if he hadn't? He had to piss somebody off or say something to somebody he shouldn't have said to start that whole ball rolling originally. Well, there was a lot of heat on, George Zahorian went down first, and for those who don't know, who are listening, George Zahorian was was appointed by the Athletic Commission in the 80s,
right?
And he was the doctor that would check you out and approve you to go into the ring. But he was also a guy who was, selling steroids in a way to the wrestlers, and then the
Dr. Feelgood. It wasn't just steroids. The boys need their candy, and if you got something wrong with you, etc. Yeah,
exactly. But then the law changed. Don't quote me because I don't have my notes in front of me, but I think around 1990, the law changed, classifying, selling drugs or selling steroids in that way or distributing them without a therapeutic use. That became basically like a heroin if you're dealing like those kind of drugs. That's how it was classified. So he's kept on doing that, while the law was changed, and then eventually so brazenly, and that's when he got nabbed for it. And then because, he was, in wrestling, but it's such a bizarre thing. It's such a bizarre story because it's like, steroids, like, and how it's really like, the way the public perception of it too was like, well, this is cheating. It's cheating if you're using steroids in like a football or another sport realm. But to question it in wrestling is kind of odd. But
it was really the neither fish nor fowl thing because, well, it doesn't help them, win the match or whatever, but it's still the same chemical being ingested and et cetera, et cetera. Right. Just people couldn't pigeonhole the use in wrestling with things in other sports and stuff they could wrap their heads around.
Right. And I think that when the law changed, it probably seemed to the prosecution at the time, and WWF being probably more of an easy target because, they did have some information based upon, which we'll get into in the episode. We can go down this for the rest of the show. But, there is a lot of there's a lot of weird jurisdictional bizarreness. The charges against Vince were really weird. It was like the charge was actually, he was charged with possibly defrauding the FDA, which is a weird charge. And so ostensibly it required Jerry to become the most well-informed, researched human about steroids up to that point. And he was able, the one thing that's amazing about Jerry in this case is that, Vince is being charged by the federal government, and Jerry wins this case calling not a single witness, which is kind of insane if you think about that. Like, they're just bringing all these guys up to the stand, and it's all just Jerry's cross-examination skills that won this case.
Yeah, and there was an element of the gang that couldn't shoot straight on the other side, but that's
right, for sure.
That's the thing about the Mark doctors. And I remember, there was one in the late 90s from Indianapolis that came up and got on the radar. And I was in some of the meetings with Joel Hackett. Mm-hmm. Something happened to him. I don't know. Maybe I've just slandered an innocent human, but he was banned and the boys were told to stay away from him because he was doing. See, the thing is, it's a double-edged sword. When you get a Mark doctor that will give the boys anything they ask for, invariably, those Mark doctors will also tell everybody in the world that they're giving the boys what they ask for.
Right.
And that's how shit like this takes place. And Vince, as we know, was concerned about it. And very well, if they'd have gotten a better case together and figured out where Long Island was and it wasn't in the state of Connecticut or whatever all those loopholes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It might have been a different story and Jerry Jarrett would have been running the WWF. Imagine that. And you also, did you pass any conversation with Mr. McDivitt on the Ultimate Warrior episode? Because that's going to be a fun one, I'm sure. That has to be an episode of Perry Mason and Matlock rolled into one. The majority of Warriors' dealings with Vince were through lawyers.
Yeah. I did ask Jerry a bit about it, when we were corresponding over the phone, but he for him, it was kind of like, yeah, there were some issues here and there. And, for him, it wasn't of a primary concern like the steroid trials were, but yeah, the Ultimate Warrior episode, is definitely, we're just finishing up actually today. It's very interesting.
Well, Warriors legal claims were never based in very much evidence or reality, but God, there was a ton of them. He made up for it in quantity, what he lacked in quality. But they've done the hit pieces in the past when the Office was on the outs with the Warrior, and then they did a nicer one when he was back on. This is, I would assume, going to be a fair, even-handed assessment of Ultimate Warrior, which means that everybody's going to bury him because nobody liked him. Would that be correct, or am I too far afield?
Well, Jason, I've been yammering. You want to?
Yeah, like there's been, there's a couple people who tended to bury him, but we were, I was a fan of Ultimate Warrior growing up. I was born in 1982, and so I was a prime audience for the Ultimate Warrior, and I had his action figures. And it's kind of like how you say in the episode, it's like as you grow up older as a fan of that character, and then when they tried to bring him back later on in the 90s, wrestling had changed at that point, so he didn't really quite fit into it. And then as he kind of faded off from wrestling and started doing more public speaking engagements, and he would speak very controversially, and so that made me as a fan really grapple with my fandom for him. But to get to interview his very first wife, Sherry Tyree, who was with him through the first 10 years of his career, and to hear her perspective of watching his very fast rise, and what made Jim Hellwig the person that he is, and what were some of the things that he dealt with in his childhood that have made him who he is, and why he may have went through the business and handled certain relationships in certain ways. Her interview really gave us I think a bit more perspective on who he was as a person and why he kind of lived his life so fast.
Yeah, and I think it's we didn't really ever intend a lot of these episodes that are in season 3, we've kind of thought about years ago about eventually getting around to. Ultimate Warrior really wasn't one that I think we ever thought of or considered until recently, and it was mostly due to the fact that our viewers just were insistent and demanded that we do a story about Ultimate Warrior, and I tried to kind of wrap my head around what would the story kind of be, because obviously his passing is just wild. The circumstances around, reconciling with Vince after that just tumultuous relationship and then dying less than or whatever, 24 hours later is just insane. And that's compelling. But obviously there is these two extremes of the self-destruction of Ultimate Warrior documentary. And then of course the one they did when they brought him back. And it was just kind of what's left there? And then when we did reach out and meet and talk to Sherry, his first wife, they were married for 10 years, I think 9 or 10 years. And for her, it's her perspective. This episode almost is kind of her story, because it's about she meets Jim when he's a bouncer and he's on a path to being a chiropractor. He's just a normal, semi-normal guy, and they're going to have a semi-normal life. And then all of a sudden his need to be in the spotlight just kind of changes everything. And they, becomes a bodybuilder, and now he's going to meet Sting and becomes a wrestler. And then he meteorically rises to, stardom very quickly. And it's just kind of this wild roller coaster ride. But I think one of the things about this episode that's very compelling is that I think Sherry does a good job of like we're saying with the Pillman and everything else, is just kind of bringing more of a human side to a complicated human portrait of who this guy is. And yeah, you're right. It was really hard to find people who wanted to speak positively about him. But I think the episode does push beyond just oh my gosh, this guy was really difficult. What a nightmare, into let's try to understand at least where he's coming from. And I do think that one thing that was eye-opening to me, and it's not an excuse obviously for some of his behavior, but the idea that from a very young age, he was absolutely aware of, his heart disease running in his family, and his father and his grandfather died very young from that. And I think that was always in the back of his mind, is that he knew his time was going to be very short. And then it leads you to believe how much was he really aware of that in the last year of his life, So I don't know.
I'm not sure that I would have gone so heavy on the monkey hormones if heart disease was running that rampantly in my family, but
right.
Which it has, and which is I'm not a big guy for monkey hormones, but here's the thing with some of the guys you profile.
Mm-hmm.
And Pillman ticks both these boxes, but invariably it's either a big star that wasn't a likable person or a likable person that never got to be a big star. But boy, it's a sad story, like a Chris Canyon. I don't know which one Johnny Canine falls in. The likable guy that blew up the police station. He was the friendliest police station bomber ever. And then Dynamite Kid, who. Right. I never got to meet in the dawn of the home videotape era. Mm-hmm. When I first got a chance to see Dynamite Kid in Japan, I'm like, my God, this guy's the baddest ass on earth. His work is immaculate. He's in condition. You think he can run 300 miles without blowing up. Yeah. I've never seen anybody just exert that level of realistic violence and badassery in pro wrestling, and it was amazing. And then you come to find out that he was pretty much a miserable human being in most cases to be around. And I never got to meet him in person. I was a huge fan, and then I've heard stories from Davey Boy Smith, but that what a strange and what's the word I'm searching for? Help me, you creative people. You've got this guy who's a super talented, performer and athlete, but he's always miserable as a human being.
Well, Jason, feel free to chime in too. But I mean, for my money, it's hard. It's hard. Like those matches with Tiger Mask. It's hard to see better wrestling than that, for me. Like when I watch that, I think it's the type of wrestling that like somebody who knows nothing about wrestling at all whatsoever, and they walk into the room and they see it on your TV, like that would captivate their attention, It's really it's like the highest level, I think, for sure.
It was what these guys have been trying to copy for the past 40 years since then, is that somehow they did a video game wrestling match and made it look legitimate. And when they got away with it, because here's the two most talented athletes in the world at what they're doing, then everybody else said, oh, well, we can do this too. And then you get a bunch of cover bands.
Well, but the only consequence of that is that it was probably pretty friggin' real. I don't know how.
Yeah. Also, when he ended up in a wheelchair. Later, right? So
got that asterisk. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and a lot of the folks we interviewed for the episode. I mean, we talked to Mick Foley for the episode, who you might not think is the first name to interview for the Dynamite Kid episode, but he talks about this story of like, he was such a huge fan of the British Bulldogs, and actually one of it was Jack Foley he was wrestling under the name of, and as one of his first matches was as a jobber in WWF, and he goes in there and he's like all excited, and then Dynamite gets tagged in, and then he clotheslines Mick and basically dislocates his jaw with one clothesline. And, and then he's, wind up, not eating solid food for 3 weeks and, barfing into a toilet for the next couple of days. And he worked, a lot of that stuff is not a magic trick because it looks so good. It's because it's real. And, he's really launching himself in, like, when you see him take those guardrail bumps, you just know that that's no good.
Yeah. The first time that I ever actually got to talk to anybody who had been around Dynamite in person was when Danny Davis, my old partner in OVW, had worked Calgary, and he came back to Tennessee and was telling me in the early 80s about, they have these ladder matches, and this guy, Dynamite, would do a thing where he would be standing up on the top of the ladder, and one of the Hart brothers, whoever, would drop kick it, and he would go over, standing on the ladder, he'd go over with the ladder, bounce off the top rope and out to the floor without touching anything. And then, of course, then Danny would say, I don't know how long he's going to be walking, but this guy is the most amazing thing you've ever seen. And, it's another cautionary tale of guys. But I've said this, almost all of these guys in their own way, whether it's on Dark Side, whether it's on the biography, anytime you have a major wrestling star, they sacrifice a lot of their personal life. They sacrifice a lot of their health. They sacrifice sometimes, I've done this, some of my sanity to be, while they're in this, especially to be the best at what they do. And that's why people remember them, because they were the best at what they do. But sometimes that's also why these kind of shows get made about them, because none of these guys were, an average CPA in fucking Brentwood.
Right.
And so you have to admire sometimes the dedication, but in some case, and where is the line? Where do you say, well, he took it too far? Well, sometimes the line's not clear until you've already crossed over it. And then you're like, shit, it was back there, wasn't it? Well, we're here now.
Yeah, especially with Dynamite Kid, it's such a clear example, especially with his, we interviewed both his daughters, and, he basically like sacrificed a relationship with his two daughters. And so we spent time with them, and to hear how they've kind of navigated their life, past, since their father has passed away, but also before he had passed away, and, trying to get some sort of relationship with him. But it is very tragic, and it does bring home the reality of, the sacrifice that goes into, the wrestling business and the ramifications on the family.
It really is like this, just, the Dynamite Kid story is a tragedy of Greek proportions, in a lot of ways, because here is the ultimate sacrifice. And again, it's why Mick is such a great voice for the episode too, because I think he can relate to that in some ways too, in terms of the physical sacrifices he's made to create the, his legacy as well. But, for Dynamite, it's like to have gone to sacrifice it all for the sake of his art, for it to be as real and believable as possible. And then just to find the fact that he wound up in a wheelchair before 40, alone and broken is wild. And obviously, he raised a lot of hell, through all of that, with all of his relationships with fellow wrestlers and his family, of course. And that's a huge part of the story. But I think also what's compelling about it is, and I think that this episode in particular is going to spark a lot of conversation after it comes out, is also just, you can tell that his family is still trying to reconcile with the legacy, because it is complicated. It's maybe one of the more complicated legacies in all of wrestling, in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's one episode that nobody dies. A few people got fired, but it's not really a dark side. If there's a tomfoolery episode, a shenanigans episode of Dark Side of the Ring, it's got to be the plane ride from hell. And this was a, by popular demand, a viewer suggestion, right? Or just everybody said, hey, you got to do this, because it's taken on a life of its own. It's that there's no grieving, surviving family to do sound bites, but this is just a bunch of alleged grown adults acting like lunatics. And it's why, besides, when I was with the WWF, they did not have a private plane. But I heard about some overseas flights where people would be on a commercial flight with too much time on their hands. That's why I never crossed the ocean and would not have flown in a WWE company plane with these jolly jokers. I loved Crockett's plane back in the 80s when it was all the boys just having fun. And occasionally you might get, if you went to sleep, Bobby Eaton would take your shoelaces out and put them in upside down and tie them together at the bottom. That was a terrible rib. But this just went completely out of hand and fucked with everybody to this day.
Yeah, it's definitely, like, since we started working on Dark Side of the Ring, pretty much any wrestling fan we've run into are like, oh, well, if you're going to do Dark Side, wrestling stories, like, you got to cover the plane ride from hell. And, we never really were able to figure out how, at the time during season 1 and season 2, how to, tell that story in 45 minutes or to extend it that long. But then when season 3 came along, we had to make 14 episodes. We thought, well, let's put some serious research behind this and see, what the story is. And, the more we dug deeper into it and did research and talked to more people who were on that airplane, it's been this story for years that has kind of been looked at as like kind of locker room foolishness or just boys being boys kind of thing. But when you really hear from some of the people who worked on that flight, there were things that happened that I could see being very traumatic, and they were. And it, really brings home the title, "The Plane Ride to Hell." It sounded like it was really hell.
See, that's the thing. Everything that I've heard that happened on that flight, I can picture and see happening in a locker room, a wrestling locker room in some territory anytime over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
But not all at the same time and not at 35,000 feet.
Yeah.
That would have been where I had the fucking issue. Wait a minute.
Yeah, I think there's
when Mad Dog Vachon tried to open the back door on Vern Gagne's fucking private plane with 6 people on it, but this was a jet.
Yeah. Yeah, this episode, I think, for me, was really tricky to try and wrap my head around for the show, because historically on shoot interviews, YouTube, you can go down the plane ride rabbit hole, on YouTube, and for a lot of it, it's talked about and chronicled as tomfoolery, like you were saying, like that's how people consider it. And I have to tell you that after cutting this whole thing together, and we have like a rough cut right now because it's not finished, this is one of the more anxiety-inducing fucking episodes of this show that I have ever, and this is in its rawest form.
Yeah.
Of absolute fucking horror show, and I don't know. This is crazy. This is like, I would never have thought that this episode would be as dark and disturbing and horrifying as it is. And I'm not exaggerating, because the context is everything too, where it's like the roster just got through this grueling European trip, and they're on their way back, and this crew has been with the wrestlers the whole trip throughout Europe, because the same plane for the whole trip, and they're at the final day where they're flying back, across the Atlantic, and there's a weather delay, and in Stamford, and the delay is 7 hours, so the plane is actually parked on the tarmac for 7 hours, and what are they doing? Well, they're going through carts and carts and carts of booze. I've never actually heard of when you run out of one cart, they'll bring you another one type of situation. But this definitely was what was going on. And then as you're understanding this, knowing what you know about this world and some of the characters that are on this flight, it's just like, oh man. And it just goes from there. And then I think that there's elements of this story that people are going to be very surprised in where it goes. And it gives me anxiety. It keeps me up at night, actually. It's an anxiety inducing episode.
These are the things that keep us up at night. Well, what else keeps you up at night? Now, season 3, that may not all be dusted off and polished and sorted and everything, but the subjects, the shows are scheduled, but who or what do you still want to do? There's going to be a season 4. These things are, especially with my appearances, highly rated. People just clamoring to see more. What else have you still got up your sleeve, or you still want to do if you could get a hold of them, or the right people, or the right way to tell the story?
Yeah, I think one just off the top of my head is the story of Gentleman Chris Adams, and how when we did season 1, we kind of structured this like Texas World Class Championship Wrestling trilogy, which was the Bruiser Brody episode, the Von Erich episode, and the Gino Hernandez episode. And we always thought like, the Chris Adams story like fits within that like universe with those 3 episodes. Mm-hmm. And when we were when we're interviewing people for the show and his name comes up, it's always followed by the most insane story you've ever heard. There's so many like crazy Chris Adams stories where he's super kicked a bartender in the face and knocked their eyeball out, and they've had to smuggle him out of Israel back to America in the middle of the night. Kevin Von Erich told us like this insane story where kind of like a plane ride from hell situation. He was drinking on the plane and he got cut off by the flight stewardess, and he got so angry that the pilot came back to try and calm him down, and he headbutted the pilot in the face and busted him open, like just bleeding everywhere, and he was bleeding all over Chris's shirt. And Kevin, like being such a good-hearted guy, was like, Chris, like, why don't you give me your shirt and I'll wear the bloody shirt and I'll talk my way out of this situation. And as soon as they land, it was like, you know, FBI cops on the plane, and they arrested Chris, and you know, he did some time for that. But and then when you hear about the ending of his life,
I don't know if I'd want to be put in a position where Kevin Von Erich had to tell a bullshit story to defend me on the spot. I don't know.
Yeah, but that's you know, and when you hear the story of the end of his life and his best friend killing him out of self-defense, it's so hard to believe. But that's something we've always, you know, even from season one, it was a story we wanted to tell. But who knows, maybe now that we did an interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin, you know, he would want to be part of that episode because he was so close to Chris and was trained by him, and that would be really cool.
Mm-hmm. And for me personally, it's like I am excited, of course, by, you know, the fact that Jerry McDivitt appeared on the show, and it's kind of like, for lack of a better term, reaching across the aisle, you know, to see if maybe there is a chance that some of the folks who are still, you know, over there in WWE, you know, because I'm assuming that he would have had to have gotten official permission to do that there's a chance that we can work with some of those and folks over there to tell stories. And I think that one of the ones that I would jump at, and I've said it, you know, before more recently, is, man, I'd love just to get Michael Hayes and do a Freebirds episode. Like I can't see why that can't happen. Some epic sweeping, you know, get into, you know, Terry Gordy and, you know, and you know, and get into Buddy's story and all that stuff. I think it would be fantastic.
And especially the early years of the Freebirds, with them driving up and down the road in Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana and wherever, though, that would have been a reality show all itself. Bobby Eaton used to ride with the Freebirds in Georgia. And he said one time the four of them, Buddy and Terry and Michael and Bobby, in either Michael or Terry's or Buddy's old car, right? But they get pulled over by the cops, and the cop walks up to the car, and it may have been Buddy Roberts driving. He opens the door, and when he opened the door, not only did a sea of empty beer cans fall out, but the whole indoor panel of the door just fell right off the actual door and out into the fucking interstate. And the cop just took a look at, he knew from television, it's the Freebirds. He just took a look at him. He turned around and walked back to his car and got in and drove off just to go away.
Amazing.
Because he didn't want to, he knew that if he went down that rabbit hole with those four guys in that car, not only would everybody know who they were, but he'd be there all night. And he just said, fuck it. But a Freebirds episode.
Yeah.
If you could shoot at Freebird Mountain, that might be very interesting.
Totally. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that one's definitely.
And of course, this season, Harley Quinn gets her obligatory close-up that's written into the contract with Vice.
Yeah,
and it's in slow motion, so that's even better, with her cute little tongue and everything.
Oh, amazing.
Well, guys, again, it's season 3 that debuts on Thursday night, May the 6th at 9 p.m. Eastern. 2 hours on Brian Pillman. Now, is it going forward on Thursdays? Is it going to be 9 Eastern or 10 Eastern for the regular 1 hour programs?
I should know.
I just asked you a question that you don't know. Well, check their local listings. Check your local listings, folks. But
I think it's
2 hour
10.
premiere. I think they did that last year too. 2 hour premiere on the 6th at 9 o'clock, and then probably going to 10 o'clock for hours for the rest of the first set of the season. But anyway, Jason and Evan, thank you guys for being on. Thank you for making me a part of the program. I enjoyed it again this year. Please come back during dogwood season. And anything else that the folks should know about what you guys have going on coming up, or just make sure to tune in and don't miss any episodes.
Yeah, essentially that. Just don't miss the episodes, and I guess we're gonna plan on doing maybe some Instagram lives or some things if you want to ask questions, or have a discourse about some of these episodes. I mean, it's a lot of.
Why don't you guys have a place like we do for the drive-through that people can email questions? They got to email you topics, subject. Chris Colt is who I'm going to go for a deep album cut. By season 5, you got to do Chris Colt.
Okay.
Oh,
Who else ever climbed out of a cage match and left the arena in the middle of the match because he saw LSD-induced giant spiders climbing the cage after him?
Whoa.
That's the pitch right there.
There you go.
Chris Colt has been on the list, but the only thing I would say is like isn't there like only a scarce amount of archival footage? I guess it doesn't really matter.
There's no tape and almost nobody left alive to tell the tale. But goddamn, what a story for that guy!
Wow, so good. Yeah, unbelievable.
Anyway, well, hey, you guys got Strangler Lewis and Henry DeGlane on national television for the first time a few years ago, so I don't see why you couldn't do that. Anyway.
It's true.
All right, I'll let you guys go. But again, it's Vice TV. It's Dark Side of the Ring. They're doing a marathon all day on May the 6th in anticipation of this. And we appreciate you guys coming on the program. We're going to watch them. And I guess I have no finish for this bit because we're going to be going back to our regular program. So I will just stop speaking. And thank you guys for being on the show.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.